So firstly, I would like to thank the Menzies Institute for Medical Research, the Menzies MS Research Flagship, and the organisers of today's event for inviting me to speak today about my MS journey. So just before my 28th birthday, on Friday the 13th of November in 2009, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. When you're first diagnosed, it's like your whole world just falls apart, and I could talk about this all day and how it affects your mental health and your well-being, but I've only been given 15 minutes. But I did go into denial when I was first diagnosed, and I thought that my neurologist just had to have had it wrong, and I didn't have MS at all. Well, here I am nearly 14 years later, and I do clearly have multiple sclerosis. So my first symptoms was painful numbness in both of my feet that just simply disappeared after 3 days. My doctor told me that I must have been wearing unsupportive and tight shoes. Now, I thought that this was unusual, but he's a doctor, so he must be right, Then 2 months later, I developed severe pain in my hip. It then went down my leg, slowly up my torso, and then all the way down my arm. So within less than a week, the whole left side of my body was paralysed from the neck down. I remember my neurologist was poking me in the arm with a pin, and I had absolutely no feeling. I couldn't feel a thing. I could hardly walk. I had no strength or coordination in my arm, and I was so confused. I couldn't focus on anything. So you can imagine how totally useless I felt at the time. I felt totally out of control of my body. My body had previously served me well for 28 years. Even with steroids, it took me a good 3 months to overcome that relapse. And I realised that I had to face my diagnosis head on and continue to be strong, not only for me, but for my husband, my 2 children, Josh and Kayla, who's here with us today. And at the time, they were only 5 and 2 years old. So I started on my medication journey, at first a drug called Kosciusko. For 14 months, I self-injected daily, and this was something that was incredibly difficult for me because I have a needle phobia. So after 14 months of my dreaded daily injections, my health continued to deteriorate. I had a routine MRI scan, and the results showed that I had more lesions in my brain and new lesions on my cervical vertebrae. When I saw my neurologist, there was a sense of urgency for me to change medication, and at the time, for my husband and I, it was absolutely terrifying. New medications meant new possible side effects from the drugs, side effects that at the time I was unable to tell some of my family about because you don't want them to worry. In the March of 2011, I started on a new medication called Tisabri. For around 6 years, every month I would go to ambulatory care at the Royal Hobart Hospital for my infusion. I did have some minor side effects from this infusion, but they only lasted for approximately 24 hours and they were very manageable. So some of the symptoms that I've experienced over the nearly 14 years are every morning I wake up tired. I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to this. You just feel like you haven't slept. I suffer really bad insomnia, and there have been days and weeks where I just have hardly slept at all. The MS exhaustion is like no other, and I can't even explain it. I can't even put it to words. I've suffered from debilitating headaches, which isn't easy when you have a family, a business, and a household to run. Nerve pain, where I feel like my limbs are on fire, and as I was talking to someone earlier, the dreaded MS hug, which is horrific. Worse than labour. At times, I've had bowel and bladder issues. I have dealt with vertigo, paralysis, memory loss, anxiety, and at times depression. These are only a small number of issues that I and other people living with MS live with on a daily basis. You're unable to see the majority of our symptoms, and that is why they call MS an invisible disease. During the time that I was on Tisabri, my MS stayed in remission, but I then relapsed and once again had new lesions. I chose to start a new infusion called Lemtrada. I had 2 yearly doses of this treatment, but I still continued to deteriorate. My neurologist obtained permission for me to have a 3rd Lemtrada infusion, but unfortunately this was also unsuccessful. So I had failed yet another MS medication, and unfortunately I suffered my first major spinal relapse. So what to do now, you're wondering? I was offered to go on another MS treatment, or I had the opportunity to have a stem cell transplant right here in Hobart. This was huge and terrifying. However, within around 5 minutes of talking to my neurologist and my husband, I decided that I would have a stem cell transplant. Thankfully, I had already researched this treatment over the years, so I did have a pretty good idea of the process. At the beginning of September in 2021, I had a strong dose of chemotherapy. Now, the chemotherapy was that strong that within a week, I started to lose my hair. A week later, I then started daily injections, and this was to stimulate stem cell growth within my bone marrow. During this process, your bones expand. I was told that this would be painful, but the more pain I experienced, the more stem cells I produced. Within a few days, I was in a whole world of pain. But for the first time in my MS journey, I was actually happy to be in pain. My stem cells were intravenously harvested on September 20, and I was told that I had produced a record number of stem cells. So no wonder I was in so much pain. My stem cells were then frozen, and I waited for a hospital admission date for the next part of my treatment. I was admitted to hospital on the 13th of October and started 6 days of strong chemotherapy. The chemotherapy removed my current immune system. Thankfully, I only experienced a little bit of nausea and loss of appetite during this time. But my MS symptoms did flare up, and I did experience some severe nerve pain in my arms and legs, but I was told that your MS symptoms can flare up during this part of your treatment in particular. During my 3rd day of chemotherapy, we got the news that we were about to go into a COVID lockdown. So you might remember that there was a man that escaped hotel quarantine and put Tassie into a 3-day lockdown. I was in the middle of my treatment. So thankfully, we found out just before the public announcement, and Scott was able to rush to pick Josh and Kayla up from school, and they came in for a visit. I was incredibly grateful that I got to see them because you guys went into a 3-day lockdown, the hospital went into a 9-day lockdown. So it was really bad timing. So it was devastating, but thank goodness for modern technology because FaceTime allowed me to virtually see my family during this time. I was also really lucky to have a fantastic roommate, and we kept one another entertained. On the 18th of October, I had my last day of chemotherapy, and I was moved into a single room in preparation for my stem cell reintroduction. I was so excited, I was exhausted, and I was nervous. On the 19th of October, I had my stem cell transplant. We were still in lockdown, so unfortunately my husband couldn't be there to hold my hand. But luckily, a close friend of mine was actually finishing her nursing degree and happened to have placement on my ward. So I felt so blessed that she was there. And she held my hand throughout this experience. Now, I have a Facebook page called Jayne's Journey, and I haven't updated it for quite a long time, but I videoed the stem cells and everything, and it's all on Facebook. And it's absolutely fascinating. So the transplant went really well, and I had no side effects. But a few days later, I had 2 antibody infusions, and unfortunately, I did react to these. I experienced severe temperature spikes, fevers and chills, a horrific looking rash that covered my torso, and I was terrified I was going to live with this rash forever. Like first world problems, right? With everything else going on. And I was in intense pain at this stage. I became septic. My temperature reached 40.7 degrees. My heart rate went crazy, blood pressure was extremely high, and my oxygen levels dropped. At this stage, I lost consciousness. When I came to, it was terrifying. The room was full of nurses and doctors, the emergency response team, and I was hooked up to a lot of medical equipment. The nurses phoned Scott into the hospital, and he was able to stay with me until my vitals stabilised. I was then rushed to surgery to have my port removed, as they thought that I might have had an infection in the line. I had to have intravenous steroids and antibiotics to help with and prevent more side effects and possible infections. I also needed 2 bags of platelets and 2 blood transfusions to keep my levels normal, so thank you to everyone that does give blood and plasma. So what an experience that was, hey? I had an incredible medical team and I was so well looked after before, during and after my treatment. I was discharged from hospital on November 1, and for the first couple of weeks I slept 20 to 22 hours a day and had little energy. But blood tests showed that my stem cells were multiplying and my immune system was slowly recovering and growing back. I was told that my mobility could be affected and that there were instances where some patients walked into hospital and came out in a wheelchair. Thankfully, I walked out of hospital. However, for a few months after I returned home, I did have mobility issues. I'd lost a lot of strength and I could generally only stand for 5 to 10 minutes before my muscles would cramp up. I'd struggle to stand and walk then. So recovery was slow, and at times I wondered if I had made the right decision to have the stem cell transplant at all. So it really did affect my mental health, and I have to say writing this speech brought it all back. So I think there's things that you put to the side and you don't think about. Been through that, done, I'm doing well. So even though I was educated in the process of the treatment, nothing could have mentally prepared me for it. It was like a roller coaster ride with so many highs and so many very low lows. So fast forward to November 2022, 13 months after my stem cell transplant and 13 years of living with MS. My sister and I completed a 4-day trek and I climbed Mount Kosciusko and reached the summit. Oh, thank you. It was absolutely incredible. It was emotional, and I just felt such a huge sense of achievement. And it was something that physically I would not have been able to do prior to my transplant, and I pretty much did the whole 4 days pain-free. I only had to take a couple of Nurofen, which is amazing. So I'm now 21 months post-transplant, and I hardly have to take any pain medication anymore. I have had 2 full MRIs. One of those was only 1 month ago. My MS is stable and I have no new lesions. So this is something that I absolutely could have never have imagined happening 2 years ago. So I'm not naive enough to think that my MS will be stable forever, but at the moment I do feel fantastic and I'm just going to take that. What's next? So next year, my sister and I are hoping to complete a 6-day trek of the South Island of New Zealand. So that's the next aim, the next goal, the next thing to look forward to. So thank you.